Hey guys, welcome back to our final video on World War II. And in this second half of our topic 7.13, we're talking today about the end of Hitler, and then we're going to talk about the end of Japan. So let's try to take stock in the situation for Nazi Germany in the late part of 1944, early 1945, and things are looking pretty grim. After 5.5 years in battle, the Nazi war machine is exhausted and ground down, and Hitler's army is full of, old men, young boys, and people who are surrendering in droves because they don't want to die in what they see as a failed war. In December 1944, Hitler decides to launch one big counter-offensive in the West. And what he does is he orders his army to attack right through here, through this forest called the Ardennes in modern-day Belgium, and also some Luxembourg as well. They're going to push through, and their goal is to get all the way up here to Antwerp. And by doing this, Hitler believes he can, capture a lot of supplies that he desperately needs because his army is running low on fuel and others, but mainly fuel, but lots of other stuff too. And also, he thought by doing this, maybe he could drive a wedge between the British and the American armies, defeat them, and then maybe somehow, some way, the Americans and the British would sign a separate treaty with Germany, and then Hitler could turn around and try to stop the Soviet advance into Germany from the east. Now, this is an incredibly ambitious and not going to work plan. Now, they do make some progress in the early days. This attack really does catch America by surprise. We assumed that Hitler was defeated, and here comes this massive attack. Now, the reason this is called the Battle of the Bulge is the shape in the American lines, rather, that the Germans create. So the Germans attack, and they tear a hole right through our lines, and that's called, again, the Battle of the Bulge. This was in the dead of winter, and one of the most intense winters on record in this part of the country. Very, very cold. Again, the Germans have the element of surprise. The weather was really bad, so this benefits the Germans because American air power, which is overwhelming at this time, can't really be used in the clouds and the snow. And the Germans make progress. They take a lot of Americans prisoners. My grandfather was in this battle, and he said it was just so cold you can barely even stand it. In fact, he, like a lot of soldiers in this battle, suffered from frostbite and eventually had to be pulled off the line because of that. Now, ultimately what happens is Hitler's attack just doesn't go where it's supposed to. There's no way it's ever going to get to Antwerp. The Germans begin losing steam. The Americans recover. The weather clears up, and Hitler's armies are obliterated. And a good example of this would be their failure to take Bastogne. Famously, the 101st Airborne was holding Bastogne. They refused to surrender even after massive German attacks. And in the end, the Germans have to kind of tuck tail and run. And what's left of the German army is being pushed back into Germany. And this is Hitler's really last chance for victory. Not that it was much of a chance anyways, but this really does seal his fate in the Western theater. Now, as advancing Allied armies come ever closer to Germany, what they, of course, uncover are the horrific concentration camps and death camps of Nazi Germany. And this was something that there was certainly a lot of evidence to suggest these things were ongoing, but I don't think anyone truly believed the extent of the horror, the inhumanity, the crime against humanity that the Nazis were doing until people witnessed it with their own eyes and saw it. And this was absolutely just devastating. Just absolutely devastating. Now, believe it or not, at the time and since World War II, FDR, our president, has received a fair amount of criticism that basically he didn't do enough to weaken the German Holocaust, that he didn't do enough to prevent the mass slaughter. I'm not entirely sure what he could have done. One idea that's been thrown out there is he could have used the American Air Force to bomb the rail lines that connect the camps. But, honestly, the Germans would have just rebuilt those rail lines. Another plan was to even bomb the camps themselves, which obviously would kill a lot of the people in the camp, but in theory would close the camp. Logic tells us that the Germans would just open another camp. So I don't really know what FDR could have done. Speaking of FDR, on April 12, 1945, he dies unexpectedly in Warm Springs, Georgia, from a cerebral hemorrhage, basically a stroke. And this man was in poor health to begin with. His re-election in 1944, his fourth and final, there had been, a fair amount of talk kind of behind the scenes about his poor health, and maybe he shouldn't run, but he did because he felt that the world, really America specifically, obviously, needed him as the war comes to an end, and then this new world is going to be created after, and he thought he needed to be there to play that role. But he dies. 18 days later, Hitler himself is dead. Different circumstances. He took his own life because, of course, he didn't want to be captured and have to answer for all of his horrible, horrible crimes. And so that's that for Hitler. And obviously, with Hitler gone, what's the point of keeping the fight up? And so about a week later, on May 7th, 1945, the Nazis surrendered. The next day was declared Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. That's May 8th, 1945. So now half the war is over, right? Half the war is over. Scenes of just happiness and exhilaration that the war's over, at least against Nazi Germany. But again, in the back of their mind, I'm sure a lot of these people are thinking, well, there's still Japan to defeat. And so let's talk about the defeat of Japan. So American air power had been one of the key ingredients in the victory against Germany. It will also be a key ingredient in our victory against Japan. The American Air Force launched massive city-killing raids over places like Tokyo, Kobe, Osaka, and pretty much all the other big cities in Japan. Many of these raids involved incendiary bombs, which are fire bombs, which were devastating against Japan because most of their cities were made primarily out of wood, and so very, very vulnerable to fire attacks. The scenes were just absolutely horrific, right? Thousands and thousands and thousands of civilians are going to die in these raids. Now, as we close in on the Japanese home islands, their resistance is obviously going to strengthen. This brings us to our final battles in the Pacific. One takes place in March 1945 when the Americans invaded Iwo Jima, this little island right here. And after 35 days and about almost 7,000 American deaths and about 20,000 Japanese deaths, the battle was over. The battle itself took place because Americans felt they had to secure these airfields on Iwo Jima for two reasons. One, so that Japanese airplanes couldn't be stationed here to shoot down American bombers as they fly to Japan, but also for American bombers who might be experiencing engine trouble or maybe they've been damaged in combat or something. These airstrips will give them a place to land rather than crashing in the sea and probably not surviving. Also of note at the Battle of Iwo Jima is the famous flag raising, right? Famous flag raising at Mount Suribachi at the top of that hill, that old volcano that was why Iwo Jima existed in the first place. It was an old volcano. And this image, it galvanized the American people. It became, I don't know, probably, if not the most famous image of World War II, it's probably top 3 or 4 for sure. Sold a lot of war bonds, no doubt. And the Marine Corps Monument in Washington, D.C. is a replica of that moment of the flag raising. All right, so Iwo Jima was a big, bloody battle in March of 1945, but the bloodiest of all battles in the Pacific took place at an island called Okinawa. And Okinawa was different in that it was a much larger island. There were many, many Japanese civilians living on the island. It was considered, basically kind of the footstep, one footstep away from the home islands. And in fact, that's why we needed this. We needed this so that we could then launch our invasion of Japan that would come in the late summer of 1945 and the spring of 1946. It was going to be a two-prong invasion. The battle itself killed thousands, and not just soldiers, also civilians who were caught in the crossfire. And the lesson we learned from this battle is that the Japanese would fight basically to the last man. And that brings us to the kamikazes. And I think most of us have heard about the kamikaze before. These are these infamous Japanese suicide pilots who would use their plane loaded up with fuel and bombs, and they would crash them into Allied ships with the goal of sinking those ships, but basically turning their aircraft into a guided missile, but guided by a pilot who's not expecting to survive, because there is no way you're going to survive that type of event. And just a couple pictures here of the kamikaze. Now, the kamikaze don't turn the tide of war, but they certainly did cause a lot of damage. It certainly freaked a lot of Americans out, and once again just speaks to that desperate struggle that the Japanese will not give up without a bitter fight. Which is a great transition into the talk of the atomic bomb. And you might wonder, well, I know we used them against Japan, but why didn't we use them against Germany? And the answer was, well, they weren't ready yet. Germany surrendered too early before the bomb was actually finished. And the motivation here behind this bomb, as part of the Manhattan Project, of course, was to avoid a massive invasion of Japan. The invasion of Japan, of course, there's no way of knowing how many Americans would have died, but the estimates are in the hundreds of thousands. Japanese losses would have been every bit as bad, probably many times worse. Japanese civilian losses would have been horrific as well. And this is one of the things people point to defend the use of the atomic bomb, that perhaps in a weird way these bombs actually saved lives. Certainly American lives, no doubt about that, but even Japanese lives it could have potentially saved. We won't get into that debate, but that is a debate. So in July 1945, this is a couple months after the Nazis have surrendered, and at Potsdam the Big Three met and they issued this ultimatum to Japan: surrender unconditionally or be destroyed. Now, we were in the process of destroying Japan using conventional bombs and incendiaries, so I'm not sure how the Japanese were supposed to take this as somehow different, but it was, because there was something different, and that something different was we now have nuclear weapons. So we need to jump back a couple years to 1940. America was not yet in the war, of course, but Germany was running rampant across Europe. France had just fallen. It looked like the end of the world. And so some scientists, including Albert Einstein here, urged our president, FDR, to develop an atomic bomb. Now, this is something that was all, totally theoretical at this point, but the idea was perhaps we can use nuclear fission, which is the splitting of atoms, and harness that energy and weaponize it. This is the letter that Albert Einstein famously sent to FDR about this. And they were motivated really, not that these scientists wanted to go kill things, far from it. Most of them were pacifist, but they believed it's better that this fall into the hands of the Americans than the Germans. I mean, can you imagine Nazi Germany with an atomic bomb? That would be catastrophic. So Congress spends about $2 billion on this project, a project that is so secret, most of them had no idea what they're even voting for. In fact, it was so secret that Harry Truman didn't even know about this project until he was sworn in after FDR died in the spring of 1945. So again, what's moving the Americans to spend more and work harder than ever is this fear that somehow, some way, the Germans might develop their own bomb. It's kind of it's a race to the finish line. Now, it turns out, we didn't know this at the time, but it turns out the German efforts to build an atomic bomb were way behind ours. And frankly, with the war going badly for them, all real serious progress had been halted. So the Germans were still years away from a bomb when we finally detonated our first out in New Mexico, a place called Alamogordo, or at least near Alamogordo, of course. And this took place on July 16th, 1945. There is the bomb, nicknamed the Gadget, and that was a test device, and sure enough, it worked. And here we are at Ground Zero, where the bombing took place. There's Robert Oppenheimer, the chief civilian scientist on this project, and then the leader of the military side of things, Leslie Groves. So the first use of this in combat was on August 6, 1945. Hiroshima was attacked by this B-29 named Enola Gay. So one plane, one bomb, and one city wiped out, killing about 70,000 people instantly, many thousands after the fact from radiation and burns. Here's a diagram of the actual bomb, codenamed Little Boy. And you can see the devastating effects. On the left is the before, on the right is the after. A couple days later, on August 9th, 1945, the United States drops another atomic bomb, this one on Nagasaki. It was a different type of bomb. It was a plutonium bomb, not a uranium bomb. It was actually more powerful, but it didn't kill as many people because Nagasaki, the topography was different. There were more hills in Nagasaki, which kind of shielded some of the city from being destroyed. Nonetheless, 40,000 Japanese civilians died instantly in the bombing. There's again before and after. So, after 2 atomic bombs, the Japanese have gotten the message. They agree to surrender, but on one condition, that Hirohito would remain emperor, and the Allies agreed to that. So that paved the way for VJ Day, September 2nd, 1945. The Japanese formally surrender in Tokyo Harbor, and they sign this armistice to end the war. I think Mr. Peanut fits in pretty well, actually, don't you think? And there is the signing. There's Douglas MacArthur. There is a happy crowd, because now the war is totally over. In fact, so happy, here we are embracing. And believe it or not, there's actually a statue of this, a very large statue. I think this is in San Diego. There's the major naval base there. I believe that's where this is at. All right, so that's it, guys, for World War II. Wow, a lot of ground to cover, and we covered it all. In our next and final video on Period 7, we're going to talk about some of the post-war changes, and that'll be it for Period 7.